Hi, how are you? Welcome to today's lesson. Today I've got Charline Chikomo. He is our special guest. We want to unpack, we want to talk, we want to discuss about slave trade and slavery. What took place during the time of slave trade and also slavery. So Charlene is going to explain to us in a detail. I'm waiting for him to join us. Soon after joining us now, he is going to explain to us what transpired during this particular period of slave trade and slavery. This is an interesting topic, especially in the Zimbabwean curricula. Why in the Zimbabwe curricula? It is because the new curricula added this topic sometime, and as a result of that now, we are now having section A, European history, and as a result of that now, we are in a position of knowing what took place during this particular period of time. So, we're waiting for Mr. Charlene to join us so that we could start our discussion. Here is Mr. Charlene. He is our invited guest today, unpacking, telling us in detail about slave trade, slavery, and also legitimate trade. How are you, Charlene?
I'm fine, Mr. Muso. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much. Possibly you can introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Charline Chikomo, but normally people know me as the DUCE of Africa. I'm a presenter for history and FRS, European history and tropical history, and also FRS. And I think I must take this opportunity to thank you as the mentor, as the person who has been teaching me how to actually present my message out there. So I owe it to you. Say thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited about your name, the Jews of Africa. Why the Jews of Africa? Possibly because today everyone in Zimbabwe, in Africa, they are watching this show. So possibly you can explain to us why you are known as the Jews of Africa.
Well, historians would know that the name Jews simply means the leader, but to put context to it, we are Africans, we are not from Europe, so I had to call myself Jews, now the leader, but to put the context of where I come from, I'm proud of the African continent, so I had to call myself Jews of Africa. So now many people associate myself with that.
That is good, excellent. Okay, without wasting much of our time at the Jews of Africa, let's go to our topic for today: slave trade and legitimate trade in West Africa. So let's start by possibly defining terms. Some people and also teachers are watching, they are joining us today. Some lecturers also in Africa and also around Zimbabwe, they are watching us. Possibly you can start by defining the term slave trade. What is slave trade?
Well, once again, thank you, and thanks to everybody who is watching. Do us a favor to actually share this video. So today we're gonna be talking about slave trade, which simply explains the shipping of Africans from the African continent to European countries such as Britain, France, Portugal, South America. We talk of Brazil, to work in plantations. So we are simply describing that transatlantic slave trade, the shipping of the. We are talking about slave Africans. So
what about
we are talking about the shipping of the
shipping of people
from the Western African states, such as Dahomey. We talk of Asante. We talk of Sokoto Caliphate. We talk of the Oyo Empire. We talk of the Manti. The shipping of people from those states to the Western African states. That's what we describe as actually the transatlantic slave trade.
Oh, brilliant. That is fantastic. So let's now talk in detail about slave trade. What happened during this period of slave trade?
Yeah. So what we need to understand is that we have West African states that I just mentioned.
Yes.
We have Asante, the likes of Dahomey, the likes of Sokoto Caliphate, the likes of Calabar, the Oyo Empire, and all these states. So we also have European countries on the other side. We have got Britain.
Let's have them slowly. Let's start. You said you've got what? Asante.
Asante.
Yes. Another one.
We have got Sokoto Caliphate.
The Sokoto Caliphate. Good. Another one.
You have got Dahomey.
Dahomey. Another one.
The Oyo Empire.
The Oyo Empire. Yes, you can proceed.
Yeah. So these are the states that are in West Africa, that were in West Africa. But we also have European countries that were involved in slave trade. We talk of number one, Britain. We talk of Portugal. We talk of South America. We talk of Brazil. So now you can see that when you are talking about trade, anything that has to do with the trade, there must be a buyer and a seller for us to call it a trade. So now that this is slave trade, we need to have the buyer and the seller. So in this case, the West African states were the ones that were selling their able-bodied men and women to the European countries that I just mentioned. But why were they selling these people? And why were they doing that? So you will realize that in Europe by that time, they were focusing on what we call plantation agriculture. Now, plantation agriculture is extensive farming where you require a lot of people to work, because that was a time before the Industrial Revolution. So they didn't have tractors, they didn't have combine harvesters, they didn't have all these machines that we now have that doesn't require a lot of labor force. So by then, they needed a lot of human labor force. And now the question was, where do we get this human labor force? That was the question of the day. Now, you realize that in Europe and America by that time, their labor force was what we call waged labor force, was what we call waged labor force, whereby your workers, they need insurance, they need salaries, they need wages. So they were very expensive. But you know, for you to make profit, you need to make sure that you spend less to get more. But in this case, the labor force that was found in America and that was found in Europe, it was expensive. But now they realize that in Africa, labor was actually free and found in abundance. There was also India, which had Indian colonies. They also had labor force. But then that of India was found out that they couldn't withstand diseases such as chicken pox and higher temperatures. The African man was found strong and fit for the job. So that resulted in slavery, in slave trade, because they needed to get labor to work in those plantations. Now West Africa became the best option for labor force. Now what else? There was also an issue, I just talked about lack of machines. So there was need for labor force to replace the machines. There was also the religious aspect of it that we cannot leave behind. The issue of churches, such as the Church of England, that manipulated the scriptures. They removed, there's what we call the slave Bible, where they removed the story of Exodus, where because they didn't want the people to see the slavery issue of Moses and the Israelites and all, it was removed. And verses like you owns the slaves will be punished, it was removed. So there was manipulation, and that also led to slave trade. We also have the issue of racial segregation, whereby the blacks were racially segregated, looked down upon, and that also led to a slave trade. But what was happening? There was what we call an exchange. So African states would go and sell their people, would go and sell the slaves. What were they getting in return? They were getting things like, for example, gunpowder. They were getting ammunition. But Mr. Muso, you and I, we are historians. We need to critique this. So there's these guns that we were getting. Some would say it was for protection. Some would say it was good for defense. But there's a problem to that, because it increased wars and death of Africans. Because for you to sell the slaves, you need to fight, because you don't sell your own people. In the same way, the Ndeveles in Zimbabwe, the Ndeveles state, they were not raiding the Ndeveles, they were raiding the Shonas. It's the same thing that was happening in West Africa. You don't raid your body, you go to raid other states. So when you go to raid other states, there's war, because you don't just get slaves, you need to fight to get them. And now you are getting guns. So it increased the death of people. They were also getting cloth, they were also getting ceramics, they were also getting clothing.
While you are on issue of guns, the ammunition that they got from these Europeans, how effective were these guns? Did they get what new guns, or they got second-hand guns? How effective were the guns that they got from these Europeans?
Okay. Right there. That's where we look at the Eurocentric and the Afrocentric theory. They had a strong debate on that we are also going to talk about during this presentation. Walter Rodney, who wrote what we call the Afrocentric theory, he said something that is so profound. He said the goods that Africans were getting are described as depressants or a heap of rubbish. They were second-hand guns, and they were not valuable as compared to the able-bodied men that the African men was selling to Europe to work for free and produce more. So these guns, it was what we call the relationship, was a relationship of a horse and a rider, whereby a rider enjoys more than the horse. So it was not fair. The trade itself was not fair. It was not balanced. The economic balance of scale was not proper.
Okay, all right, it's fine. I can understand. Let's continue.
Now, so what do we need now, Mr. Muso, to say, to look at this slave trade, to look at the effects that it had on the African continent, which is a question and something that our syllabus, the new curriculum syllabus, needs our students to understand. What are the effects of slave trade in West Africa? Now, how do we understand that? We use what we call the Afrocentric and the Eurocentric theory to explain that. What is the Afrocentric theory?
Before going further, clarification on this term Afrocentric, what does it mean? Eurocentric, so some might also want to understand what you mean by Euro, what you mean by Afro. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
The positive, because it is trying to put the European men here, while the Afrocentric theory is also trying to put African men here. So the Afrocentric, in short, it supports Africans and it talks about things from an African perspective, whereby the Eurocentric supports the European men and it looks at the setup of things from a European perspective. But we are historians, we need to strike a balance. Now, can I proceed?
Can you proceed, please?
Yes. Who wrote the Afrocentric theory and who wrote the Eurocentric theory? The Afrocentric theory was written by Walter Rodney, and the Eurocentric theory was written by J.D. Fedge. Now, we need now to understand what do they talk about in these theories and what supports what they are talking about. Remember, we are looking at the effects, positive and negative effects of slave trade. Now, Walter Rodney, in his Afrocentric theory, he actually started by a statement. He said, the best thing about slave trade is that it ended. He said, if there is anything good about slave trade, it is that it ended, which means he's looking at the negative effects of it. Right? But J.D. Fedge was said in his opening statement, he said, the slave trade was a big business. Without it, Africa could have been more backward than Europe. So here, J.D. Fedge said, no, comrades, slave trade was actually a big business. Had it not because of slave trade, Africa by now could be more backward than Europe. What Rodney is saying, no, comrade. The best thing about slave trade is actually that it ended. Now, which we have already figured out the size. And I love Arthur Marara. He has got a very good book on this one. He wrote very profound stuff on this and on this topic. Students can also read this book. Yes. Now, what do we need now to do? We look now at the positive and the negative effects of slave trade. Number one, slave trade resulted in the creation of bigger and stronger West African states. But it's not enough to just say bigger and stronger, powerful states. Which states are you talking about? Give examples to show that you know what I'm talking about. For example, we have got Asante and Dahomey. These are two bigger states that rose as a result of slave trade. But how are we saying that? Number one, why are we saying a Dahomey? Why are we saying Mr. Muso, a Dahomey and Asante rose because of slave trade? Number one, we are saying that because the formation of Dahomey itself, as Dahomey actually managed to move from the weaker oil empire, and there was creation of Dahomey. The formation of Dahomey was as a result of slave trade, because Dahomey was an offshoot from the weaker oil empire, and it was formed because of slave trade, whereby slave trade was the backbone of the economy of Dahomey. Asante also, slave actually according to the Cambridge History of West Africa written by E.C. E.C. said something profound. He said Asante also, the backbone of the economy of Asante was also slave trade. But now, Mr. Muso, Asante state, when slave trade was banned in 1830, the abolition of the slave trade declined. So, Asante declined after slave trade yabannwa. Zvinotaridza kuti iwe wangoiseva slave trade. Apart from slave trade, you cannot survive. Therefore, we cannot take away the fact that muntu wako wanga uchipa slave trade. So Asante and Dahomey were the two stronger states that can be talked about, and they are a clear evidence that they rose because of slave trade as a positive factor. But now, however, how did they become bigger states, and how did they become stronger states? Number one, they were rebelling. The weaker and the weaker states. They were rebelling smaller states. Oil was declining, and Dahomey used to get slaves there from the weaker states. So, in other words, it is a miscarriage of justice for a historian to argue that just because Asante and Dahomey rose because of slave trade, therefore slave trade was good. How did they get those slaves? Where were they getting them from? They were rebelling, they were raiding, they were killing people, they were destroying smaller states. So it was a survival of the fittest. Therefore, yes, as the bigger states were rising, the smaller states were crumbling. So one cannot 100% argue that slave trade was a benefit because it led to the rise of the big and the stronger states, where we are seeing that as the bigger were rising, the smaller were falling. So that is a miscarriage of justice. So we need to strike a balance in dealing with that. Is that clear? Okay.
It's clear. It's very clear. Okay, possibly before you go any further, what are you saying? So are you saying that the slave trade, it had far-reaching effects to the African states during this particular period of time?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh. So what I'm saying here is that we need to understand that we can't just say, okay, it's good to say slave trade resulted in the creation of bigger and stronger West African states, Asante and Dahomey. But we need actually to critique that, to examine it, to actually say, can we just say that and close the argument? However, on the negative side, they were getting those slaves from the smaller and the weaker states, which they were destroying. So it was a survival of the fittest. Therefore, such an argument must be treated with caution. We need to look at both sides of the coin. That's what I've just done here.
Okay, it's fine. Okay, let's continue.
Okay, point number 2. Slave trade also, the African states, they got access to European goods, right? They got access to European goods. We talk of guns, although we discredit them to say they were not that good. We'll do that on the negative side. They got guns, they managed to get clothes, they managed to get beverages, they managed to get, a lot access to European goods. So that also is said as a positive aspect of slave trade, although I'll deal with that later on the negative side so that maybe we can avoid confusion. Let me not elaborate. I'll talk about that maybe on the other side.
Okay.
So they also say Africans got access to European goods, and they actually describe the goods to say, hey, it not because of slave trade, which was a form of trade. It gave access to Africans. They got access to European goods, and I've listed the type of goods that are talked about. But we'll talk about those goods later also on the negative side, right? And also, slave trade resulted in the civilization of Africans. But I want to explain that point in a more better way than what I've seen many people doing, so that it makes more sense. Mr. Muso, this is how it is explained. During slave trade, Africans were taken to Europe, to America, and when they go there, they were exposed to European civilization. And they were exposed to modernization, they were exposed to education, better ways of farming, better ways of mining, better ways of agriculture, and all that. But someone who is listening here might be saying to me, so where is civilization there? Mr. Muso, in 1830, Britain passed the Anti-Slavery Act, and Britain released the slaves to the free town of Sierra Leone. The free town of Sierra Leone, there were a group of people called the Creoles, who were the ex-slaves, the people who were returned back to the African continent when the slavery was banned in 1830 through what we call Anti-Slavery Act. Now, where is civilization now? If you look now at Sierra Leone, that's the reason why it was not colonized in that, because of the slaves. It was a free town. But now we need to understand something here. Now, we need to understand that when these people were returned, they become the first doctors, the first lawyers, the first newspaper editors, and they opened a university at Fora Bay. And they started to, the missionaries, that's where they started. Why? Because they were exposed to modernization. They were exposed to European Western.
Let me chip in there. To what extent, how many benefited from this civilization? How many benefited from this education system that was introduced by the foreigners? Is it not a quarter, or we are talking about?
Yeah.
It's not a quarter, or we are talking about the vast majority.
Mr. Muso, you are coming up with a great question right there. So, of course, a few people benefited, and I wanted to deal with that in the negative effect so that I won't mix. But now that you asked, let me just drop something powerful there. Walter Rodney, Afrocentric theory, dropped a very crucial point as a rebuttal for this point. He said, were there no any other better means of modernizing and civilizing Africa rather than slave trades? And he went on to question on the quantity, the numbers of people who were educated. There was just a few minority groups that also when they came to West Africa, they started to have a problem of what we call social Darwinism, whereby they were thinking that they are better than the indigenous people who were there. And there was a war that actually happened called the Mendeteme uprising, because they were starting to think that they are better than others. So it also led to problems, and few people were educated. We cannot talk of the freed slaves. If you look at the number, I mean, of the people who were exploited and the number of people who were returned back, doesn't tally. So to a lesser extent, that civilization and modernization can be talked about.
Okay. So that is to a lesser extent, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, let's proceed.
Yeah. Now, So these are all the benefits that they talk about, and they talk about the fact that and also, Mr. Muso, there is an argument that was raised by J.D. Fage. Of course, the argument is not that historically correct, but let me drop it so that the learners will be able to decipher and see if they want the point or not.
Okay.
J.D. Fage raised 2 points in his Eurocentric theory that are not so correct. Number one, he said because Walter Rodney raised a point that so many people died when they were shipped across the Atlantic because the transportation was very manipulative, exploitative, and people were dying along the way. And J.D. Fage, as a defense to that, he said the number of people who died during slavery could be the same number of people who would have died in West Africa because of human sacrifices. For example, in Dahomey and a hunger that was in West Africa. So he's saying you cannot blame us for killing people. You would have killed yourself because you also do human sacrifices. We know that according to the religion of Dahomey, they were doing human sacrifices. And they themselves, number two, were also, hunger was there. So he's saying you would also could have actually killed those people. So you cannot blame us to a greater extent, but of which we can't justify failure by failure. It's an argument that is not that strong. But not only that, he went on to say, if you are saying that slave trade resulted in the depopulation of West Africa or coastal areas, why is it that today West Africa is one of the most densely populated areas in the African continent? Of course, it doesn't make sense because we do polygamy and some people were returned back and all that. But these are ways to try and, rubber stamp crucial arguments that were raised. So these are some of the positive factors. We talk about rise of stronger and bigger states. Number two, Africans gaining access to European goods. Number three, civilization and modernization in the African continent, particularly with the issue of Creoles who were returned to the African continent. They built bridges, they become the first doctors. We talk of people like Samuel Ajayi Crowther, the missionaries and all that. Number four, we also talk about the relationship. It resulted in a relationship between European countries and African countries. They were better connected through that a form of trade, and Africans were introduced to make better methods of selling, and there was also increased standards of living amongst the people. However, with your permission, my good sir, can I also look at the negative effects of slave trade?
Okay, let's go to the negative. Possibly after negative, now we do an overall assessment of slave trade. Whether can you say that it was to a greater or to a lesser extent? Let's talk about the negative effects.
Thank you very much, my good sir. Now, on the negative side, the factor number one is slave trade resulted in the depopulation of West Africa or coastal areas. Why are we saying that? And let me justify how this depopulation was all about. Number one, the slaves, the way the slaves were hunted, there was killing, because it's war. You don't just go and take a slave. There was war. People were fighting to get the slaves, and during those wars, clash between states and states, many people died there during that what we call the hunting stage. And when you're hunting for the slaves, you kill other people. Number one. Number two, during the shipping across the Atlantic, the Europeans and Americans were very brutal. Even if you look at some of the pictures, which we can share after this presentation on the page for our students to see, so many people, and if you misbehave during the shipping, so some people died before even getting to where they were supposed to go. Many people lost their lives because of how brutal the transportation was, of how people were brutalized, butchered, massacred during the transport. The European and the American men was not so kind to the African brothers. They were not so kind. They were naked when they were transported. They would put matanta musoroma kwa ufemi. You can't breathe. You can't breathe. Then you cannot in the sea. They would throw you in the sea and you die. So many Africans died, not even before, after when they get there, but during the transportation process. And when they get there, now they work there. Imagine working unlimited hours, no salary, no insurance, no what, you are suffering, and so you can die quickly. So many people lost their lives, Mr. Muso. Many people died, many people were massacred. But we know that there is a reproduction that needed to take place. So wives were left with no husbands, and there was no reproduction to take place in the West African continent. Many people now are resulting in depopulation of our beautiful West African continent. So it is a miscarriage of justice to talk of states that were created, to talk of civilization, yet you butchered and massacred our people who were in the African continent. So depopulation is the first point. Now, second point, on the negative effects is what is on the negative effects is the issue of it increased the tension, Mr. Muso, between the West African states. And let me explain what I'm talking about, Mr. Muso. We were talking about West African states such as Mr. Muso, Dahomey, Asante, Sokoto Caliphate, Calabar, Oyo, Boni, Itsekiriland, all these states. But Mr. Muso, let me take you to Zimbabwe a little bit so that our students can understand what I'm talking about. When I was growing up, I remember my grandmother in her 70s, she was telling me that we used to receive here people called Majiti from Matebeleland who would come and take our things, take our women, beat us and all that. In other words, I'm saying the people of the Ndebele state were raiding the Shona people. So at the end of the day, the Shonas and the Ndebeles were not in good books. That is the same situation that we can take to West Africa to say, when they were hunting and raiding for these slaves, raiding an African state against an African state, it increased the tension between the African states, whereby you are going to raid another state for its slaves, for its people, for its able-bodied men for that matter. So there was tension because you are fighting, there are wars in Africa. So it was divide and rule, whereby Africans were made to divide against themselves, fighting against themselves, beating themselves, killing themselves. So there was tension between African states, while the European and American men is smiling there, while we were butchering and massacring ourselves. So there was tension, division between them amongst the West African states as a negative factor. Number 3, Mr. Muso, is what we call, let's talk about population in terms of the demographic transition model, in terms of the population pyramid. We know that for a country or for a state to survive, it is because of what we call the working class. It was what we call the economically active people who are normally between the age of, let's just say, 16 to 60 something. Now, Mr. Muso, what the white men, what these people were doing, they were taking able-bodied men like the DUCE of Africa and you, Mr. Muso. So we go to Europe to work in the plantations. The men with 6 packs, those stronger ones, are the ones that they were taking. Imagine, they are leaving the kids and they are leaving the elders. Who was there now to work for the survival of the West African states? There was nobody. It was able-bodied men and the working class was taken. So the demographics of the African continent were affected because our working class was taken to Europe and to America. At the end of the day, Mr. Muso, we do not have people who can work in the African continent. We do not have the working class. And Mr. Muso, you are a historian. You have studied so many states, and you know very well that army was actually a group of young people who are energetic. So who was there now, Mr. Muso, to protect our states? Our men were taken to Europe. Who was there, Mr. Muso, to cultivate the Zundera Mambo in our field, the community fields? No one was there. Who was there, Mr. Muso, to find food for the family? Our men were taken. Who was there, Mr. Muso, to act as the advisory council for our kings? Our men were taken. So that demographically, in terms of the working population, affected the African continent. But we need to also go to other points, Mr. Muso, points like when we're talking about civilization and modernization. we need to understand that it's a bit raining here, and I think you are still hearing me.
Okay.
You are still hearing me, right?
I can hear you.
Yes.
It's raining. Yes, very hot. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So on the negative effects also, we cannot conclude without also talking about the unfairness, Mr. Muso, of the trade that was happening. Imagine, Mr. Muso, you take a boy like me, very strong and fit, with my six-pack and with all everything. You take me to Europe. You take a man like you, Mr. Muso, to Europe, and then you come back home with a beer. You come back home with a cigarette. So Walter wrote in the Afrocentric theory, Mr. Muso brought a crucial point that would be very unfair for me to close my mouth before talking about it. He said the goods that Africans were getting, they can be described as depressants or a heap of rubbish. Why was it? And he goes on to say, it was also a moment when so many diseases were brought to Africans. For example, sexually transmitted diseases. And if you get a cigarette, you suffer from what we call liver cirrhosis, and you suffer from lung cancer and all that because of cigarettes and beer, and you die quickly. So, but you are selling able-bodied men. So this trade, Mr. Muso, was very unfair. The white man was getting more than our African brothers. This relationship, Mr. Muso, was a relationship between a horse and a rider. It was very unfair for European men to take able-bodied men and giving our forefathers a beer, cigarettes, and causing the transmission of sexually transmitted disease in the African continent. So this is how we talk about, or when we talk about a slave trade and legitimate trade. So for this moment, let me allow you to come in before we go to the abolition now of slave trade.
Okay, exciting presentation, Charline. You are really unpacking about what transpired during this particular period of time, and you have shown us the positivity of slave trade, and also managed to show us about the negativity of slave trade. So many Africans died. There was cruelty, the situation, the position that took place during that particular period of time. It was horrible, and as a result of that, now we see that so many Africans stay affected by slave trade, by the activities of slave trade and slavery. So possibly you now want to talk about the last aspect on the abolishment of slave trade. Why was it eventually abolished? So possibly we are going to talk about the abolishment. Then after that, now we take a commercial break. We break for about 5 minutes. Then we come and do the legitimate trade. So the legitimate trade is going to stand on its own so that our video won't be too long. So you talk about the abolishment. Then after that, we take a short break of 5 minutes. Then we'll come back. Then we'll finish and talk about the legitimate trade, right?
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much, Mr. Muso. It's actually, that's the best way. Let me talk about abolition, and then we take our break, and then we come and scatter legitimate trade on its own so that we won't confuse our beautiful listening audience and those who are looking at us now. Now, when we say abolition, I love what Arthur Marara in his book said. He said in 1830, Britain passed the Anti-Slavery Act, but there was no automatic moratorium. I love the jargon. But let me simplify it for our learners to get it in a Karachiti abolition, kuchimisa slave trade, kuchibvisa slave trade, kuchirambidza slave trade, kuti slave trade ichirambwa. We are talking about the banning, the stopping of slave trade. We are talking about a time where slave trade was then stopped. Now, in 1830, Mr. Muso, Britain passed what we call the Anti-Slavery Act, which forbids all countries involving in issues to do with slave trade. But why was Britain at the forefront of banning slave trade? It's a question that needs to be asked. So Britain was the first country to be mechanically industrialized. By the way, I didn't say industrialized. I said mechanically industrialized. Now, what is mechanic industrialization? I studied about mechanization in Form 1 in commerce, whereby they are talking about using machines, let's say combine harvesters, let's say tractors, let's say all these machines for industries. So Britain now introduced such machines whereby the desire for labor was reduced. The need reduced. Apachadi vanhu 20, apachadi vanhu 20,000 because tine taraki tinoona kurima munda nemunhu 1. Apachadi vanhu 50,000 nekuti tine combine harvester inogona kuharvesta nemunhu 1. Apachadi vanhu pavakuda raw materials. So you can see that the approach or the desire or the demand shifted from the need for labor to the need for raw materials. For example, instead of wanting labor force, we now want a situation where oil for our machines to work. We now want a situation where we have rubber, cotton for our industries to function. So Britain realized that. So now Britain wanted to come up with what we call legitimate trade, legitimate from the word legal, legitimate trade, whereby people in West Africa were now supposed to grow cotton, rubber, gum trees, vegetables. You can sell gold, you can sell other things, not human beings. Now, but why did that happen? And why was slave trade finally abolished? Number one, what you need to know is that we have got political, social, religious, and economic factors to explain why slave trade was abolished in the year 1830. Number one, economically, there was a shift of demand from slave labor force to machinery industry. There was a shift from extensive, from labor force oriented industry to mechanized industries. So what are we saying here? We are saying the Britain at that time no longer needed slaves, but there was a strong need for raw materials since its industry was industrialized. There was introduction of combined harvesters, tractors, and all that. That doesn't necessarily need slaves, but machines. So there was a need for Britain to return slaves back to West Africa and then teach them to start growing cotton, rubber, palm oil, vegetables, doing mining, gold, and all that, so that we can have raw materials for the industry. So Zimsek can ask you, the banning of slave trade was more of promoting self-interest. These are self-interest because you can see that Africans are not in, their interests are not that shifted from labor force, and now they are in mechanized. So everyone in the world needs to shift because Britain has shifted. You can see how selfish they are. You can see them for who they are. They promote self-interest here. So that's number one, economically. And number two, there is also the humanitarian aspect of this, whereby preachers, human rights lawyers began to condemn the selling of people and this human trafficking and all that. It was seen as evil human rights by human rights lawyers and churches such as the Church of England, who began to condemn it, and as a result the Parliament of Britain and all that passed that the selling of human beings was wrong, so there was need for the abolition of slave trade. So these are all factors that then led in 1830 to the abolition of slave trade and the introduction of legitimate trade, that we shall talk about maybe later if there's no question.
Oh, powerful, Charline, well detailed, well explained. Thank you so much for unpacking. Thank you so much for explaining in detail about what transpired, about what took place during this particular period of slave trade. So you have heard for yourself, you talked about the introduction of slave trade. You started by defining the term slave trade. talked about slave trade in detail, talked about the states that benefited from slave trade. You talked about the Asante, talked about the Sokoto, you talked about Dahomey, you talked about the Oyo benefiting from slave trade. Then Mr. Charline also moved on, talked about the positive effects of slave trade and also the negative effects of slave trade. And now finally he was talking about the abolishment of slave trade. It was condemned. It was seen as inhuman. Humanitarians to condemn the activities of slave trade and slavery, and eventually it was abolished. So for now, let's stop here. I'm with my special guest today. We are so privileged to have Mr. Charline Chikomo, also known as the Juice of Africa. He is the Juice of Africa, telling us about what transpired during that particular period of time. So we are going to take a commercial break. Then we come back after 5 minutes. Then after 5 minutes now, we are going to talk about the next aspect, Mr. Chikomo, the Juice of Africa, unpacking about the legitimate trade. Legi, what is Legi? He's going to tell us about Legi, what took place during this time of legitimate trade. Thank you so much, Mr. Chikomo. Let's take a commercial break. See you soon.